Mother Bear climbed 2 flights, carrying oxygen for a baby. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Cedar Ridge, carrying with it the bitter cold of another harsh winter night. Snow fell in thick sheets, blanketing the small mountain town in an eerie silence that only winter storms could bring. The old apartment building on Maple Street creaked under the weight of accumulated snow, its windows glowing yellow against the darkness, like tired eyes fighting sleep. Inside apartment 2B, Nora Chen sat beside her 3-month-old son's crib, her hands trembling as she adjusted the oxygen tube around tiny Oliver's nose. The machine beside the crib hummed steadily, its rhythmic sound the only thing keeping her sanity intact. Oliver had been born with a rare lung condition, and the portable oxygen concentrator had become as essential as breathing itself. "Come on, baby," Nora whispered, her voice cracking as she watched Oliver's chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths. "Mama's here. You're going to be okay." The apartment felt unusually cold tonight, despite the heater running constantly. Nora pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. Her husband Marcus would be home from his night shift at the hospital in a few hours, but right now it felt like she was carrying the weight of the world alone. Outside, something moved in the shadows between the pine trees that bordered the building's parking lot. A massive brown bear, easily weighing over 400 pounds, emerged from the tree line with careful, deliberate steps. Her name was Coda, though no human had ever bothered to give her one. She had been wandering these mountains for 8 years, raising cubs and surviving the harsh winters that claimed so many of her kind. Tonight was different. Tonight, Coda wasn't hunting for food or seeking shelter. She moved with purpose, her large head tilted upward toward the apartment building, her nostrils flaring as she caught a scent that made every maternal instinct in her body surge to life. The scent of distress, the unmistakable smell of a struggling young one. Coda had lost 2 cubs the previous winter to the cold and lack of food. The pain still lived in her chest, a hollow ache that never quite went away. But this scent, this desperate need she could smell drifting down from one of the windows above, triggered something deep and primal within her. Back in apartment 2B, Nora had dozed off in the rocking chair beside Oliver's crib. The exhaustion of 3 months with barely any sleep had finally caught up with her. She didn't hear the soft beeping that began emanating from the oxygen machine. She didn't notice the way the steady green light began to flicker amber, then red. The machine that kept her son alive was running out of power. Oliver's breathing became more labored, his tiny fists clenching as his body struggled for the oxygen it desperately needed. His soft whimpers finally woke Nora, who shot up from the chair with the panic that had become her constant companion. "No, no, no," she gasped, rushing to the machine and frantically pressing buttons. The display showed a low battery warning, but that was impossible. She had charged it just yesterday. Her hands shook as she reached for the backup battery pack, only to find it completely dead as well. The power had been flickering all evening due to the storm. The machine hadn't been charging properly. Oliver's lips were starting to turn blue. Nora grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and dialed Marcus's number. It went straight to voicemail. The hospital where he worked was probably dealing with storm-related emergencies, and cell towers were likely affected by the weather. "Think, Nora, think," she whispered to herself, pacing the small room as Oliver's breathing became increasingly desperate. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away in good weather. In this storm, it might take over an hour. The local clinic was closed, and Dr. Martinez, Oliver's pediatrician, lived on the other side of town. Even if she could reach him, Oliver needed oxygen now. Outside, Coda had found something that made her pause. Near the building's service entrance, a medical supply delivery truck sat abandoned. Its driver probably taking shelter somewhere until the storm passed. The back doors had been left slightly ajar, and inside, secured in metal racks, were green oxygen tanks of various sizes. Coda had never seen such objects before, but the scent coming from them was the same clean, life-giving smell that surrounded the distressed cub in the building above. Her powerful nose could detect the concentrated oxygen even through the metal containers. Without understanding the human concept of theft or property, Coda approached the truck. Her massive paw swatted at one of the smaller portable tanks, knocking it loose from its restraint. The tank rolled across the truck bed with a metallic clang that echoed through the snowy night. The sound made Nora look up from where she was frantically searching through medical supply cabinets for anything that might help. She had found an old manual resuscitation bag that Marcus had brought home from work months ago, but she wasn't trained to use it properly on an infant. What was that? She whispered to herself, moving to the window. What she saw made her question her own sanity. A massive, brown bear stood beside a medical supply truck in the parking lot below, a green oxygen tank at her feet. The bear's head was tilted upward, and even from 2 stories up, Nora could swear the animal was looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the snowy darkness, and something passed between them. Something that transcended species, language, and logic. It was the recognition of one mother seeing another, both desperate to save a child in need. Coda picked up the oxygen tank in her powerful jaws, her teeth carefully positioned to avoid puncturing the metal. The tank was heavy, nearly 40 pounds, but Coda had carried her own cubs many times when they were too tired or sick to walk. She approached the building and began to climb. The fire escape on the side of the building was old and weathered, its metal rungs covered in ice and snow. Each step Coda took sent vibrations through the structure, but she climbed with surprising grace for such a large animal. The tank in her mouth clinked softly against the metal rails as she ascended, her claws finding purchase on the slippery surfaces. Nora watched in absolute amazement, her phone forgotten in her hand. This couldn't be happening. Bears didn't climb buildings carrying medical equipment. Bears didn't understand human needs. Bears certainly didn't risk their own safety to help human babies they'd never met. But there she was, this magnificent creature scaling 2 flights of stairs with an oxygen tank, driven by something that went beyond animal instinct. Oliver's breathing had become so shallow that Nora could barely see his chest moving. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her stomach clench with terror. She had maybe minutes before she would lose him. Coda reached the 2nd-floor landing of the fire escape, directly outside Nora's window. The bear was breathing heavily from the climb and the weight of the tank, her breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. She gently set the oxygen tank down on the metal grating and looked through the window at the scene inside. The human female was holding a tiny cub, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her ear to its chest. The little one was clearly struggling, its breathing labored and weak. Coda could smell the distress, the fear, the desperate love of a mother watching her baby slip away. It was the same feeling she had experienced when she lost her own cubs. Coda lifted her massive paw and tapped gently on the window glass. The sound made Nora jump, nearly dropping Oliver in her arms. She had been so focused on her baby's failing condition that she had almost forgotten about the impossible sight outside her window. Now, face to face with a massive brown bear, separated only by a thin pane of glass, reality hit her like a sledgehammer. This was insane. This was dangerous. This was everything every survival guide had ever warned against. But Oliver was dying in her arms. Nora looked down at her son's face, his lips now a frightening shade of blue-gray, his tiny body going limp. Then she looked back at the bear, who was sitting patiently on the fire escape, the oxygen tank beside her like an offering. The bear's eyes were intelligent, almost human-like in their depth. There was something there that Nora recognized, something that spoke to the deepest part of her maternal soul. This wasn't a predator looking for prey. This was another mother who understood desperation. "Oh, God," Nora whispered, her voice barely audible. "What am I supposed to do?" Coda seemed to understand the human's fear. She had encountered humans before, and she knew they were usually terrified of her kind. But this situation was different. The little cub in the female's arms was fading fast, and Coda could smell death beginning to creep into the room. The bear moved slowly, deliberately, away from the window and picked up the oxygen tank again. She held it up as if showing Nora what she had brought. Then she set it down and tapped the window once more, this time more insistently. Nora's mind raced. The window had a simple latch mechanism. It would be easy to open. But opening a window to let in a 400-pound wild bear went against every instinct she had. What if the bear attacked? What if this was all some horrible trick of nature, and she was about to get both herself and Oliver killed? But then Oliver made a sound that stopped her heart. A tiny, rattling gasp that sounded like air being forced through a straw. His eyes had closed, and his breathing had become so shallow she could barely detect it. He was dying, right now, in her arms. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to Oliver, tears streaming down her face. "Mama has to try something crazy." Nora carefully placed Oliver back in his crib, making sure his head was elevated, then approached the window with shaking hands. She could see her own reflection in the glass, pale and terrified, superimposed over the image of the massive bear waiting patiently outside. The latch clicked open with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the night. Cold air rushed into the apartment as Nora slowly raised the window. Snow swirled in, melting immediately on the warm floor. The bear was so close now that Nora could see individual snowflakes caught in her thick fur, could hear her breathing, could smell the wild scent of the forest clinging to her massive frame. For a moment neither moved. Woman and bear regarded each other across the threshold, two mothers separated by species but united by desperation. Then Coda did something that made Nora's legs nearly give out from shock. The bear spoke. Not in words, of course, but in a low, gentle, rumbling sound that was clearly communicative. It was the same sound Nora had heard mother cats make to their kittens, the same tone she herself used when comforting Oliver. It was universal, this language of motherhood, and it transcended every barrier between them. Coda carefully picked up the oxygen tank and extended it toward the window opening. She was being incredibly gentle, moving slowly so as not to frighten the human female any more than necessary. The tank was positioned perfectly for Nora to grab it without having to come any closer to the bear's massive jaws. Nora reached out with trembling hands and grasped the cold metal of the oxygen tank. It was heavier than she expected, and for a moment she struggled to pull it through the window opening. Coda, sensing the difficulty, gave the tank a gentle push from her end, helping to guide it safely inside. The moment the tank was secure in Nora's hands, she felt a surge of hope unlike anything she had ever experienced. The tank was full, the gauge showing maximum pressure. It was exactly what Oliver needed, delivered by the most unlikely savior imaginable. But as Nora turned to rush to Oliver's crib, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps on the stairs outside her apartment door. Heavy, authoritative footsteps that could only belong to one person. Building security guard Dutch Henley, a man who shot first and asked questions later, especially when it came to wild animals. Dutch had been making his rounds when he heard the strange noises coming from the fire escape. Metal clanging, unusual sounds that didn't belong in the middle of a snowstorm. He had grabbed his shotgun from the security office and was now climbing the stairs to investigate, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. If Dutch found a bear on the fire escape outside her apartment, he would kill it without hesitation. The man had been bragging for months about wanting to bag a bear, saying they were getting too comfortable around human settlements. "No," she whispered, looking back at Coda, who was still sitting patiently on the fire escape. "You have to go. You have to run." But Coda wasn't moving. She was looking past Nora into the apartment, her sensitive nose detecting something that made her entire body tense with alarm. The smell of death was getting stronger around the little cub. Oliver had stopped breathing. Nora spun around to see her son lying completely still in his crib, his tiny chest no longer rising and falling. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that she recognized from her worst nightmares. "Oliver!" she screamed, dropping the oxygen tank with a loud clang as she rushed to the crib. She scooped up her son's lifeless body, his head lolling back in a way that made her stomach lurch. He was so small, so fragile, so impossibly still. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be the end. Behind her, she heard Dutch's key turning in the apartment door lock. He had a master key for emergencies, and the screaming had convinced him this qualified. In front of her, through the open window, Coda made a decision that would haunt Nora for the rest of her life. The bear climbed through the window. All 400 pounds of wild predator squeezed through the opening with surprising grace, landing silently on the apartment floor. Snow melted beneath her massive paws as she approached the crib where Nora was holding her lifeless son. "Get away!" Nora sobbed, clutching Oliver protectively. "Please, just get away." But Coda wasn't interested in harming anyone. She had smelled this smell before, the terrible scent of a cub slipping away from life. She had experienced the helpless desperation of watching her own babies die, knowing there was nothing she could do to save them. This time was different. This time, she might be able to help. Coda approached slowly, her massive head lowered in a non-threatening posture. She made that same gentle rumbling sound, the universal language of maternal comfort. When she was close enough, she did something that defied everything science knew about bear behavior. She began to perform what could only be described as CPR. Using her massive paw, Coda gently but firmly pressed on Oliver's tiny chest in a rhythmic pattern. The pressure was perfectly calibrated, somehow instinctive, as if she understood exactly how much force was needed for such a small body. Between compressions, she lowered her great head and breathed warm air across Oliver's face, her breath carrying the scent of the wild, but also something else. Life, vitality, the essence of survival itself. Nora watched in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face, as this impossible scene unfolded. A wild bear was trying to resuscitate her dying son, and somehow, impossibly, it seemed to know exactly what it was doing. The apartment door burst open just as Oliver's eyes fluttered. Dutch Henley stood in the doorway, shotgun raised, his face a mask of shock and confusion as he took in the scene before him. A massive brown bear was hunched over a woman holding a baby, and from his angle, it looked like the worst-case scenario he had always prepared for. "Get down!" he shouted, raising his weapon. "Get away from that bear!" But before anyone could move, Oliver took a breath. a small, shuddering gasp that was the most beautiful sound Nora had ever heard. His eyes opened, unfocused but alive, and he made a soft mewling sound that filled the apartment with hope. Coda immediately backed away from the crib, her job done. She had felt the little cub's heartbeat strengthen under her paw, had sensed the return of life force that had been slipping away. The maternal satisfaction she felt was the same she had experienced when successfully nursing her own cubs back to health. "Don't shoot!" Nora screamed at Dutch, who was still aiming his shotgun at Coda. "She saved him. She saved my baby." Dutch's finger hesitated on the trigger. What he was seeing didn't match any of his preconceptions about bear encounters. The animal wasn't acting aggressively. In fact, she seemed to be deliberately moving away from the humans, giving them space. But years of conditioning told him that bears were dangerous, that they killed people, that his job was to protect the building's residents from exactly this kind of situation. "Ma'am, step away from the bear," he said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "I need a clear shot." "No!" Nora clutched Oliver tighter, positioning herself between Dutch and Coda. "You don't understand. She brought him oxygen. She saved his life." Oliver was breathing more steadily now, his color slowly returning to normal. The combination of Coda's compressions and the fresh air she had breathed across his face had somehow restarted his respiratory system. It was medically impossible, scientifically inexplicable, but undeniably real. Coda, sensing the tension in the room and the threat posed by the human male with the weapon, began backing toward the open window. She had done what she came to do. The little cub was breathing again. The scent of death had receded, and her maternal mission was complete. But as she reached the window, something unexpected happened. The fire escape, weakened by the storm and the unusual stress of supporting a 400-pound bear, gave way with a groaning screech of twisted metal. Coda fell 2 stories, landing in a snowdrift with a tremendous impact that shook the entire building. The sound of her body hitting the ground was like a thunderclap, followed by an ominous silence that made Nora's heart stop all over again. "Oh God, no." Nora rushed to the window, still holding Oliver, and looked down at the motionless form of the bear lying in the snow below. Coda wasn't moving. The creature who had risked everything to save a human child, who had climbed 2 flights carrying oxygen and performed an impossible rescue, now lay crumpled in the parking lot like a discarded toy. Dutch lowered his shotgun, the immediate threat apparently over, but his face was grim. "Ma'am, you need to get yourself and that baby to the hospital right now, and you need to call animal control about the bear." "She's not just the bear," Nora whispered, tears falling onto Oliver's face as she looked down at Coda's still form. "She's a hero." But even as she spoke, she could see something that made her heart race with a different kind of fear. Coda was bleeding into the white snow, creating an expanding pool of red that looked black in the artificial light from the building. The fall had seriously injured her, possibly fatally. And in the distance, growing louder by the minute, Nora could hear the howl of sirens. Someone had called the authorities, and they were coming fast. When they arrived and found an injured bear in the apartment building's parking lot, there would be no questions asked about heroism or impossible rescues. There would only be standard protocol: put down the dangerous animal and protect human lives. Nora looked down at Oliver, breathing peacefully in her arms thanks to Coda's intervention, then back at the motionless bear who had sacrificed everything to save him. She had maybe 10 minutes before the authorities arrived. 10 minutes to make a decision that would haunt her forever. 10 minutes to choose between her own safety and saving the life of the creature who had saved her son. Dutch was already reaching for his radio, preparing to call in the bear incident, when Nora made a decision that surprised even herself. "Wait," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Please, just wait." She handed Oliver to Dutch, who instinctively cradled the baby despite his confusion. "Hold him. Make sure he keeps breathing. I'll be right back." "Ma'am, where are you going?" Dutch called after her as she rushed toward her bedroom. "The paramedics will be here soon. You need to stay put." But Nora was already rummaging through her closet, pulling out every blanket and warm clothing item she could find. Her mind was racing, calculating possibilities, weighing risks. Marcus kept emergency medical supplies in their bedroom closet. He was always bringing home expired items from the hospital rather than letting them go to waste. She found what she was looking for, a large animal sedative kit that Marcus had brought home months ago when the hospital had been treating injured wildlife brought in by rangers. It was meant for large dogs, but the dosage instructions included weight calculations that could theoretically work for bigger animals. "You're not seriously thinking about going down there?" Dutch said, as Nora rushed past him toward the door, arms full of blankets and medical supplies. "She saved my son's life," Nora replied, not stopping. "I'm not letting her die in a parking lot." The sirens were getting louder now, maybe 5 minutes away. Nora ran down the stairs and out into the storm, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. Snow was falling harder now, and the wind whipped it into her face as she approached Coda's motionless form. Up close, the bear looked even more massive than she had from the window. Her fur was thick and beautiful, marked with scars that told stories of a life lived in the wild. Blood was seeping from somewhere beneath her, staining the snow in an ever-widening circle. But she was breathing. Shallow, labored breaths that created small puffs of steam in the frigid air. "I'm here," Nora whispered, kneeling beside the injured bear. "I'm here, and I'm going to help you." Coda's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the human voice. She tried to lift her head but couldn't manage it. The fall had done serious damage, possibly broken ribs, internal bleeding, maybe worse. But she was alert enough to recognize the scent of the human female who had been caring for the little cub. Nora spread the blankets over Coda's massive form, trying to keep her warm and prevent shock from setting in. The bear's breathing was becoming more regular, but Nora could see pain in her intelligent eyes. "I know you're hurt," Nora said softly, her hands trembling as she tried to figure out where the bleeding was coming from. "But I need you to trust me, okay? I'm going to try to help you, but first, I need to make sure you won't hurt me." The sedative in the kit was designed for emergency situations where injured animals needed to be transported safely. Nora had watched Marcus use similar medications at the hospital, but she had never administered anything like this herself. Her hands shook as she prepared the injection. Too much could kill Coda. Too little might not be enough to keep her calm when the authorities arrived, and she had no idea how a wild bear would react to being touched by a human while injured and vulnerable. "Please forgive me," she whispered as she found what she hoped was the right spot and administered the sedative. Coda felt the sharp pinch of the needle but didn't have the strength to react violently. The human's scent was familiar now, mixed with the smell of the little cub she had helped save. There was no aggression in this human, only the same desperate concern that Coda had felt for her own cubs. Within minutes, Coda's breathing deepened and her massive body relaxed. The sedative was working, but she remained conscious, her eyes tracking Nora's movements with what almost looked like gratitude. The sirens were getting very close now. Nora could see flashing lights reflecting off the snow-covered buildings in the distance. She had maybe 2 minutes before the police, paramedics, and animal control arrived. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. Tracks in the snow. small tracks, leading away from where Coda had fallen. Bear cub tracks. Nora's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Coda wasn't alone. She had a baby, and when she had fallen from the fire escape, the cub had run away in fear. Now there was a baby bear somewhere in the storm, alone and terrified, probably waiting for its mother to come back. "Oh no," Nora breathed, following the tracks with her eyes. They led toward the dense forest that bordered the apartment complex, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. The first police car arrived just as Nora was making another impossible decision. Officer Jake Martinez stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon when he saw the scene before him. A woman kneeling beside a massive, injured bear in a snowy parking lot was not something covered in any police training manual. "Ma'am, step away from the animal immediately," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She's sedated," Nora called back, not moving from Coda's side. "She's not dangerous right now. Ma'am, I need you to move away from the bear, now." Nora looked down at Coda, whose eyes were now heavy with the sedative but still alert. Then she looked toward the forest where a baby bear was lost and alone in the storm. The mother bear had risked everything to save Oliver. How could Nora do any less for Coda's cub? "There's a baby," she said, standing up slowly with her hands visible. "A baby bear. It ran into the forest when she fell. It's alone out there." Officer Martinez exchanged glances with his partner, Officer Sarah Chen, who had just arrived in a second patrol car. This situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. "Ma'am, that's not our concern right now," Martinez said. "We need to secure this area and get medical attention for you and your family." "I'm fine," Nora insisted. "My baby is fine. But there's a baby bear out there that's going to die if we don't do something." The paramedics arrived next, followed closely by the animal control truck. Nora watched with growing despair as the situation rapidly spiraled out of her control. The animal control officers were already discussing humane euthanasia for the injured bear, using clinical terms that made Nora's stomach turn. "Wait," she said, stepping between them and Coda. "You don't understand. She saved my son's life. She brought him oxygen when his machine failed. She performed CPR on him. She's not just some random bear. She's a hero." The animal control officers exchanged skeptical looks. Tom Bradley, the senior officer, had been dealing with problem bears for 15 years, and he had heard every sob story in the book. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but bears don't perform CPR. They don't understand human medical needs. What you experienced was probably coincidence combined with stress and fear." "It wasn't coincidence." Nora's voice rose with frustration. "I saw her do it. She knew exactly what she was doing." Dutch appeared at her side, still holding Oliver, who was now breathing normally and seemed to be sleeping peacefully. "She's telling the truth," he said quietly. "I saw it too. That bear, she did something I've never seen before. She brought that oxygen tank up 2 flights of stairs, and when the baby stopped breathing, she helped him somehow." Tom Bradley looked from Dutch to Nora, then down at the sedated bear. In his experience, injured bears were either aggressive or catatonic. This one was calm but alert, almost as if she was listening to the conversation. "Even if that's true," he said carefully, "she's badly injured. The most humane thing we can do is put her out of her misery." "No!" Nora's voice cracked with emotion. "Please, there has to be another way. She has a baby out there. If you kill her, you're condemning her cub to death too." That's when Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived. Dr. Vasquez was a wildlife veterinarian who worked with the State Park Service and often consulted on bear-related incidents. She had been called in because of the unusual nature of the situation. A bear found inside an apartment complex with evidence of human interaction. "What do we have here?" she asked, kneeling beside Coda and immediately beginning a professional assessment. "Injured adult female, probably around 8 years old," Tom Bradley reported. "Fell from a second-story fire escape. Possible internal injuries, definite trauma. We're recommending euthanasia." Dr. Vasquez ran her hands expertly over Coda's body, checking for broken bones, internal bleeding, and other trauma indicators. The bear remained calm under her touch, the sedative keeping her relaxed but not unconscious. "She's hurt, but it's not as bad as it looks," Dr. Vasquez said after several minutes of examination. "A couple of cracked ribs, some bruising, but I don't feel any major internal damage. The bleeding is from surface wounds. She's actually in pretty good shape considering the fall." "So she could survive?" Nora asked hopefully. "With proper medical care, yes, but that's not the real issue here." Dr. Vasquez stood up and brushed snow from her knees. "The real issue is that she's lost her fear of humans. A bear that's willing to enter human buildings, interact with people, bring human objects, that's a bear that's become habituated. And habituated bears are dangerous bears." Nora felt her heart sink. "But she didn't hurt anyone. She helped us." "This time," Dr. Vasquez said gently. "But next time, she might not be so helpful. She might be hungry or stressed or protective of her territory. A bear that's comfortable around humans is a bear that will eventually have to be destroyed." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze. A high-pitched whining cry from the forest. The unmistakable sound of a distressed bear cub calling for its mother. Coda's eyes immediately became alert despite the sedative. She tried to lift her head toward the sound, making a low rumbling noise deep in her throat. Even injured and drugged, her maternal instincts were strong. "That's her baby," Nora said, the pieces falling into place. "She's been trying to get back to her baby this whole time." Dr. Vasquez looked toward the forest where the cries were coming from, then back at Coda. "How old would you estimate the cub to be?" "Based on the tracks and the sound, probably 4 or 5 months old," Tom Bradley answered. "Too young to survive on its own, especially in this weather. So, if we euthanize the mother, the cub dies too," Nora said, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision facing them. "And if we don't, we have 2 habituated bears that could pose a threat to human safety," Dr. Vasquez replied. The cub's cries were getting more frequent now, more desperate. Coda was becoming increasingly agitated, fighting against the sedative in her desperate need to reach her baby. "There is a third option, Doctor," Vasquez said slowly, as if she was thinking through the implications as she spoke. "But it's risky, expensive, and there's no guarantee it would work." "What option?" Nora asked immediately. "Relocation. We could treat her injuries, then move both bears to a remote area hundreds of miles from here, somewhere they'd have no contact with humans. It's been done before, but the success rate is only about 50%. Many relocated bears either die from the stress or find their way back to human areas." Tom Bradley shook his head. "The department doesn't have the budget for that kind of operation, especially not for a bear that's already proven to be habituated." "I'll pay for it," Nora said without hesitation. "Whatever it costs, I'll pay for it." "Ma'am, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. Veterinary care, transportation, monitoring equipment, follow-up tracking. It's not something you can just write a check for." "Then I'll figure it out," Nora said firmly. "I'll get a loan, I'll start a fundraiser, I'll do whatever it takes. She saved my son's life. I owe her this much." Dr. Vasquez looked at the determined woman, then at the injured bear, then toward the forest where a baby bear was crying for its mother. In her 20 years of wildlife veterinary work, she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. "There's something else we need to consider," she said. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. That means capturing the cub first, before it gets too far from its mother. And that means going into the forest in the middle of a snowstorm to find a scared, potentially aggressive baby bear." Officer Martinez, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward. "I'll go with you. I've got experience with wildlife tracking." "I'm coming too," Nora said immediately. "Absolutely not," Tom Bradley interjected. "You're a civilian with no training. This is dangerous enough without adding someone who doesn't know what they're doing." "I'm the reason this happened," Nora said. "If I hadn't opened that window, if I hadn't let her into my apartment, she wouldn't have fallen. I'm responsible for this situation, and I'm going to help fix it." Dr. Vasquez studied Nora's face, seeing the determination there. "Have you ever been in the woods at night in a storm?" "No." "Have you ever been near a wild bear cub?" "No." "Do you understand that a frightened bear cub will fight with everything it has, and that even a baby bear can cause serious injury?" "Yes." Dr. Vasquez sighed. "Then I guess you're coming with us. But you follow my lead. You do exactly what I say. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" Nora nodded, her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure. As they prepared to enter the forest, Coda made a sound that none of them had heard before. A low, complex vocalization that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal communication. She was looking directly at Nora, and for a moment it seemed like she was trying to communicate something important. "She's trying to tell us something," Nora said, kneeling beside the bear again. "Bears don't communicate with humans," Tom Bradley said dismissively. But Dr. Vasquez wasn't so sure. In her years of working with wildlife, she had seen animals do things that science said were impossible. And tonight, she had already witnessed a bear perform what appeared to be medical intervention on a human infant. "Maybe they do," she said quietly. "Maybe we just haven't been listening." The cub's cries were getting fainter now, which meant it was moving deeper into the forest. If they were going to find it, they needed to move quickly. As they prepared to leave, Nora took one last look at Coda, who was now resting more peacefully under the blankets but still alert. "We'll find your baby," she promised, "and we'll make sure you both get home safely." What she didn't know was that this promise would lead them into the darkest, most dangerous part of the forest, where they would discover something that would change everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Something that would make Coda's heroic rescue seem like just the beginning of an even more incredible story. The forest at night in a snowstorm was like entering another world. The beam from Dr. Vasquez's flashlight cut through the swirling snow, creating a narrow tunnel of visibility in the endless darkness. Behind her, Officer Martinez followed with his own light, while Nora brought up the rear, her borrowed police flashlight trembling in her cold hands. The cub's cries had stopped about 10 minutes after they entered the tree line, which Dr. Vasquez explained was both good and bad news. Good because it meant the cub wasn't wasting energy calling for help that might not come. Bad because it made tracking much more difficult. "Stay close, Doctor," Vasquez whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind howling through the pine branches. "Bear cubs are incredibly good at hiding when they're scared. We might walk right past it and never know." The tracks they had been following were getting harder to see as fresh snow filled them in. What had started as clear paw prints in the parking lot were now just vague depressions that could have been made by anything. Nora's feet were already numb with cold, despite the insulated boots Officer Martinez had found for her in the police station. She couldn't stop thinking about Oliver, safe and warm back at the apartment with Dutch watching over him. Her maternal instincts were screaming at her to go back, to be with her own baby, but every time she thought about turning around, she remembered Koda's eyes, the intelligence there, the unmistakable recognition of one mother helping another. "Wait," Officer Martinez said suddenly, holding up his hand. "Do you hear that?" They all stopped and listened. Through the storm, barely audible, came a sound that made Nora's heart skip. Not the cub's cries, but something else. Something that sounded almost like music. "What is that?" Nora whispered. Dr. Vasquez frowned, tilting her head to better catch the sound. It was rhythmic, almost melodic, but unlike anything she had ever heard in the wild. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, beyond a ridge that rose up ahead of them. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's not natural. Bears don't make sounds like that." They continued forward, following the faint musical sound through the trees. The forest grew thicker as they climbed, the pine branches so dense that very little snow was reaching the ground beneath them. Their flashlight beams revealed a carpet of old pine needles and moss that muffled their footsteps. The sound was getting clearer now, and Nora realized with shock that it wasn't music at all. It was vocalization. Complex, layered vocalizations that sounded almost like a conversation. Are those bears talking to each other?" she asked in amazement. "Bears don't talk," Officer Martinez said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. What they were hearing certainly sounded like communication, far more sophisticated than any animal sounds he had ever encountered. Dr. Vasquez had stopped walking entirely. In her 20 years of wildlife work, she had never heard anything like this. The vocalizations were coming from multiple sources, different pitches and tones weaving together in what could only be described as a pattern. "We need to be very careful here," she said quietly. "If there are multiple bears ahead of us, we could be walking into a dangerous situation." But as they crested the ridge and looked down into the small valley beyond, what they saw defied every assumption they had about bear behavior. In a clearing surrounded by enormous pine trees, at least a dozen bears were gathered in what could only be described as a circle. Adults and cubs of various ages, all sitting quietly as if they were listening. In the center of the circle, an enormous male bear, easily twice the size of Koda, was making the complex vocalizations they had heard. His sounds were answered by others in the group, creating a back-and-forth pattern that was unmistakably conversational. "My God," Dr. Vasquez breathed. "They're having a meeting." Nora spotted Koda's cub immediately. The little bear was sitting between two adult females, safe and apparently calm. But as she watched, something even more extraordinary happened. The large male in the center turned toward their hiding spot on the ridge and made a specific sound. Every bear in the circle turned to look in their direction, as if they had been told exactly where the humans were hiding. "They know we're here," Officer Martinez whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Don't," Dr. Vasquez said firmly. "They're not acting aggressively. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have already charged." The large male made another vocalization, and something incredible happened. The bears began to part, creating a clear path from the edge of the circle to where Koda's cub was sitting. It was an invitation. "They want us to come down there," Nora said in disbelief. "That's impossible," Officer Martinez protested. "Bears don't invite humans into their whatever this is." But Dr. Vasquez was already moving down the slope, her scientific curiosity overcoming her caution. "They're not acting like any bears I've ever studied. This behavior, it's not random, it's organized, purposeful." As they approached the circle, Nora could see the bears more clearly. They were all different ages and sizes, but they shared something she hadn't noticed in Coda. Their eyes. There was an intelligence there that went beyond animal instinct, an awareness that seemed almost human. The large male, clearly the leader of this group, approached them slowly. He was massive, probably 8 feet tall when he reared up on his hind legs, but his posture was non-threatening. When he was about 10 feet away, he sat down and began to vocalize again. Dr. Vasquez listened intently, trying to make sense of the sounds. There were patterns there, repetitions and variations that suggested structure. It wasn't random noise, it was language. I think he's trying to tell us something about Coda, she said slowly. As if he understood, the large male turned toward Coda's cub and made a different sound. The little bear immediately got up and began walking toward them, showing no fear of the humans. When the cub reached Nora, it did something that made her gasp with surprise. It gently touched her hand with its nose, then looked up at her with the same intelligent eyes she had seen in its mother. "It knows," she whispered. "It knows that I helped its mother." Officer Martinez was backing away slowly, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of what he was witnessing. This isn't natural. Bears don't behave like this. They don't have meetings. They don't communicate with humans. They don't. His words were cut off by a new sound from the forest behind them. A helicopter. The distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of rotor blades cutting through the storm. The bears immediately became agitated. The large male let out a sound that was clearly a warning, and the circle began to break apart as the bears prepared to flee. "No, wait," Nora called out, but it was too late. The helicopter was getting closer, and the bears' ancient fear of human machinery was overriding whatever unusual behavior had brought them together. Within moments, the clearing was empty except for Coda's cub, who seemed torn between following the other bears and staying near the humans who had come to help its mother. Dr. Vasquez quickly scooped up the cub, which submitted to being held with surprising docility. It was larger than she had expected, probably weighing about 30 pounds, but it felt fragile in her arms. "We need to get back to Coda," she said urgently. "If that helicopter is bringing more authorities, this whole situation is about to get much more complicated." As they made their way back through the forest, Nora couldn't stop thinking about what they had witnessed. Bears didn't have meetings. Bears didn't communicate in complex patterns. Bears didn't invite humans into their gatherings. But they had just seen all of those things happen. "Dr. Vasquez," she said as they navigated through the trees, "in all your years of wildlife work, have you ever seen anything like that?" "Never," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "What we just witnessed, it challenges everything we know about bear intelligence and social behavior. If I hadn't seen it myself, I would never believe it." The helicopter was directly overhead now, its searchlight cutting through the storm and illuminating patches of forest in stark white light. They could hear voices over a loudspeaker, but the words were lost in the wind and rotor noise. When they finally emerged from the tree line back into the apartment complex parking lot, the scene had changed dramatically. The simple bear rescue had become a full-scale emergency response. There were now 6 police cars, 2 ambulances, 3 animal control vehicles, and a helicopter circling overhead. News vans were pulling into the parking lot, their satellite dishes extended and cameras already rolling. Coda was still lying where they had left her, but now she was surrounded by a crowd of officials, reporters, and curious residents who had been evacuated from the building. "This is about to become a circus," Officer Martinez said grimly. Dr. Vasquez clutched the cub closer to her chest. The little bear was shivering. Whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. "We need to get this cub to its mother quickly," before the media turns this into something sensational. But as they approached the crowd, Nora realized they had another problem. Standing near Coda, wearing an expensive suit despite the storm, was a man she recognized from television. Commissioner Robert Hayes, the head of the state wildlife department, known for his hardline stance on problem animals. Commissioner Hayes was already talking to reporters, his voice carrying over the noise of the scene. Clear case of a habituated bear that poses a significant threat to public safety. The animal will be humanely euthanized as soon as possible, and will be conducting a full investigation into how this situation was allowed to develop. No! Nora broke away from Dr. Vasquez and Officer Martinez running toward the commissioner. You can't kill her, she saved my baby's life. The news cameras immediately swung toward her, and Nora found herself caught in a blaze of lights and shouted questions. Ma'am, can you tell us what happened? Is it true that a bear entered your apartment? How do you feel about calls to have the animal destroyed? Commissioner Hayes held up his hand for silence. I understand the resident has an emotional attachment to this situation, but we need to be guided by science and public safety, not sentiment. Science? Dr. Vasquez appeared at Nora's side, still holding the cub. Commissioner, I've just witnessed behavior that challenges everything we think we know about bear intelligence. This isn't a typical habituation case. Commissioner Hayes looked at the cub in Dr. Vasquez's arms with obvious disapproval. Dr. Vasquez, you know the protocols as well as I do. A bear that has lost its fear of humans is a dangerous bear. The fact that it has a cub only makes the situation more volatile. The cub in Dr. Vasquez's arms began to make soft vocalizations, the same complex sounds they had heard in the forest. Coda, despite the sedative, immediately responded with her own vocalizations. The mother and baby were communicating, and everyone in the crowd could hear it. That's not normal bear behavior, Dr. Vasquez said, looking directly at Commissioner Hayes. Normal bears don't vocalize like that. These animals are exhibiting cognitive abilities that we need to study, not destroy. Commissioner Hayes was about to respond when something happened that silenced everyone in the parking lot. More bears emerged from the forest. Not just one or two, but the entire group they had seen in the clearing. Led by the massive male, they approached the edge of the parking lot and stopped, forming a line between the trees and the crowd of humans. They weren't advancing aggressively. They weren't retreating. They were simply watching. Waiting. The helicopter pilot, seeing the new threat, began to descend, probably preparing to drive the bears back into the forest. But Coda, despite her injuries and sedation, began to vocalize more urgently. Her calls were answered by the bears at the forest edge, and something in their communication seemed to calm the approaching helicopter. Or maybe it was the sight of what happened next that made the pilot reconsider his approach. The massive male bear walked slowly across the parking lot, ignoring the shouting humans and flashing cameras, until he reached Coda's side. He lay down beside her, close enough to provide warmth and comfort, but careful not to disturb her injuries. It was a gesture of such obvious tenderness and intelligence that even Commissioner Hayes fell silent. They're a family, Nora whispered, tears streaming down her face. They're not just random animals. They're a family and they're trying to help each other. Dr. Vasquez carefully approached Coda and the male bear, still carrying the cub. When she was close enough, she gently set the cub down beside its mother. The reunion was heartbreaking in its beauty. Coda nuzzled her baby with obvious relief, while the male bear, presumably the father, watched protectively over both of them. The other bears at the forest edge began to vocalize, their complex communications carrying across the parking lot like a song of joy. Commissioner, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying the authority of her years of experience. "If you kill these bears, you'll be destroying something remarkable, something that could change our understanding of animal intelligence forever." Commissioner Hayes looked around at the crowd of reporters, the gathered officials, and the citizens who had come out despite the storm to witness this extraordinary event. The cameras were rolling. The story was already spreading, and his decision would be scrutinized by the entire country. But before he could respond, the male bear did something that changed everything. He stood up, walked directly to Commissioner Hayes, and gently placed something at his feet. It was a child's mitten. Small, pink, obviously dropped by some little girl who had been playing in the forest recently. The bear had brought it back, had saved it, had returned it to the humans because he understood that it belonged to one of their cubs. Commissioner Hayes stared down at the mitten, then up at the massive bear who was watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. For the first time in his career, he was faced with evidence that maybe, just maybe, bears were more than just animals. Maybe they were something much more extraordinary than any human had ever imagined. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Commissioner Hayes bent down slowly and picked up the small pink mitten. It was hand-knitted, probably made by a loving grandmother, with tiny snowflakes embroidered around the cuff. As he held it in his hands, he could almost picture the little girl who had lost it, probably crying when she realized her favorite mitten was gone. The massive bear continued to watch him, waiting patiently for some kind of response. There was no aggression in the animal's posture, no threat, just an ancient intelligence that seemed to understand the weight of this moment. The parking lot had fallen completely silent except for the sound of falling snow and the distant hum of the helicopter hovering above. Every camera was focused on Commissioner Hayes. Every reporter held their breath, waiting to see what decision would be made. Hayes looked from the mitten to the bear, then to Coda, lying peacefully with her cub and mate beside her. He thought about his 30 years in wildlife management, all the policies he had written, all the problem animals he had authorized to be destroyed in the name of public safety. He had always believed that animals were driven purely by instinct, that they lacked the cognitive ability for complex thought or emotion. But the scene before him challenged every assumption he had built his career on. A bear had climbed 2 flights of stairs carrying oxygen to save a human baby. A community of bears had gathered in the forest like a council, communicating in sophisticated patterns that resembled language more than animal calls. A father bear had risked approaching a crowd of humans to return a lost child's mitten. These weren't the actions of simple animals driven by instinct. These were the actions of beings capable of empathy, reasoning, and moral choice. Commissioner Hayes looked out at the crowd of people surrounding him. The police officers, the paramedics, the reporters, the residents who had ventured out into the storm to witness this extraordinary event. He saw Dr. Vasquez holding her breath, waiting for his decision. He saw Nora Chen, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her baby son, the child who was alive because a wild bear had chosen to help rather than harm. He saw Officer Martinez, who had witnessed the bear meeting in the forest and was now questioning everything he thought he knew about wildlife. He saw Dutch, the security guard who had been ready to shoot, but had instead become a protector of the very animals he had feared. Most importantly, he saw the bears themselves, the family unit lying together in the snow, supporting each other through injury and trauma. The community of bears at the forest edge, staying close to offer comfort and protection to their injured member. The father bear, who had approached him with a gesture of such profound kindness that it had shaken him to his core. Commissioner Hayes had built his reputation on making tough decisions quickly and standing by them regardless of public opinion. But this decision felt different. This decision would define not just his career, but his humanity. He looked down at the mitten one more time, then walked slowly to where Coda lay with her family. The massive male bear watched his approach but didn't move away. When Hayes was close enough, he knelt down beside the injured mother bear. "I've spent my whole career thinking I understood animals," he said quietly, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every person in the crowd. "I thought they were predictable, simple, driven only by basic needs and instincts." He reached out slowly and gently touched Coda's massive paw. She didn't flinch or show any fear. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes with that profound intelligence that had shaken everyone who encountered it. "But you're not simple, are you?" he continued, his voice growing stronger. "You're something extraordinary, something that deserves our respect, our protection, and our wonder." He stood up and turned to face the crowd, the cameras, the waiting world. "These bears will not be destroyed," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his position but also something new, humility. "Instead, they will be relocated to a protected sanctuary where they can live safely away from human contact. Dr. Vasquez will oversee their medical care and recovery." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Nora Chen broke through the circle of officials and approached Commissioner Hayes, Oliver still sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Thank you," she said, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Thank you for seeing what I saw. Thank you for understanding that some connections transcend species." Commissioner Hayes nodded, then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He knelt down beside Coda one more time and carefully placed the pink mitten where she could see it. "This belongs to one of our cubs," he said softly. "Thank you for caring about our young ones the way we should learn to care about yours." Coda looked at the mitten, then back at Commissioner Hayes. She made a soft vocalization, gentle and warm, that somehow conveyed understanding and acceptance. The male bear approached Commissioner Hayes once more, this time extending his massive paw in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of peace. Hayes, acting on instinct and newfound respect, reached out and touched the bear's paw with his own hand. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, an image that would become iconic around the world. A human and a bear, connected by understanding and mutual respect. As the medical team began preparing Coda for transport to the wildlife sanctuary, the other bears slowly retreated to the forest edge. But they didn't disappear entirely. They remained visible, watching over their family member until they were sure she was safe. Dr. Vasquez coordinated the careful loading of Coda into a specialized wildlife transport vehicle, with her mate and cub traveling alongside her. The little cub that had been lost in the forest was now safe with its family, just as Oliver was safe with his. Nora stood with her son in her arms, watching as the bear family was prepared for their journey to a new home. Dutch appeared beside her, shaking his head in amazement. "In 40 years of security work, I've never seen anything like this," he said. "That bear? She really did save little Oliver's life, didn't she?" "She did more than that," Nora replied, looking down at her son who was awake now and looking around with curious eyes. "She showed us that love and compassion aren't limited to our own species. She showed us that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come from the most unexpected places." As the transport vehicles pulled away, heading toward the sanctuary where Coda and her family would begin a new life, something magical happened. The bears at the forest edge began to vocalize together, their complex communications creating a harmony that sounded almost like a song. It was a goodbye, a farewell to the family that had touched so many human lives. But it was also something more, a promise that the connection forged that night between two species would not be forgotten. Commissioner Hayes stood listening to the bear song, the pink mitten still in his hands. When the last notes faded into the snowy night, he looked up at the gathered crowd. "Tonight, we learned that we share this world with beings far more remarkable than we ever imagined," he said. "And perhaps, if we're lucky, we learned how to be a little more remarkable ourselves." 6 months later, Dr. Vasquez received a radio transmission from the monitoring equipment attached to Coda's collar. The bear family had not only survived their relocation but thrived in their new home. Coda had fully recovered from her injuries. Her cub had grown strong and healthy, and they had been accepted by the local bear population. But most remarkably, the monitoring equipment had recorded something unprecedented. Coda and her family were teaching other bears the complex vocalizations they had observed during their time near human settlements. The sophisticated communication patterns were spreading through the bear population, suggesting a level of cultural transmission that science had never documented in wild animals. Nora Chen kept a framed photo on her desk at work, a picture of Coda lying in the snow with the oxygen tank beside her, taken just moments after the rescue. Oliver, now 9 months old and completely healthy, would sometimes point at the picture and make happy baby sounds, as if he somehow remembered the bear who saved his life. The pink mitten found its way back to its original owner, a 5-year-old girl named Emma, whose grandmother had indeed knitted it with love. When Emma's parents told her the story of how a bear had found and returned her lost mitten, she insisted on writing a thank you letter to the Nice Bear family. The letter, along with hundreds of others from children around the world, was delivered to the sanctuary where Coda and her family lived. Dr. Vasquez would read the letters aloud during her visits, convinced that somehow the bears understood they were messages of gratitude and love. And sometimes, late at night, when the mountain wind carried just the right sounds through the sanctuary, visitors would swear they could hear something extraordinary drifting through the trees. The sound of bears singing, complex, beautiful vocalizations that spoke of family, of sacrifice, of the profound connections that bind all living things together in ways that science was only beginning to understand. It was the sound of love transcending species, of heroes found in the most unlikely places, and of the simple truth that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage come from the decision to help others, regardless of the cost to ourselves. On snowy nights in Cedar Ridge, when the wind howls through the streets and families gather close to keep warm, people still tell the story of the mother bear who climbed 2 flights carrying oxygen for a baby. They tell it to their children, who tell it to their children, keeping alive the memory of the night when the impossible became possible, and love proved stronger than every barrier that divides us. And somewhere in a protected sanctuary, surrounded by mountains and forests, a bear family sleeps peacefully under the stars, their remarkable story having touched the world and changed forever, how humans understand the extraordinary creatures we share this planet with. The connection forged that snowy night between Nora and Coda, between human and bear, between mother and mother, continues to ripple outward like waves on a pond, touching lives and opening hearts in ways that will never be fully measured but will never be forgotten. Because some stories, some acts of love, some moments of pure grace transcend everything we think we know about the world, and remind us that miracles are always possible when hearts are open and courage leads the way.